Hi, my name is Chris from the Hypro Service Department. Today I'll be showing you how to work on a 9910-D403. This is the 9910-D403 diaphragm pump. Some of you may have this 9910-Kit 2200 shaft adapter kit included, which is a 6-spline PTO style, bolts up to the crankshaft right here. Some of the tools that you'll need to work on a D403 include a rubber hammer, a torque wrench, an external snap ring pliers, and internal snap ring pliers, preferably a large one, a 13mm socket, a 21mm socket, a 5mm Allen, a 6mm Allen, a 13mm open-end wrench, a small screwdriver, and a permanent marker. Let's get started. The first thing is to drain the oil. There are 2 drain plugs on the bottom of the pump. The one that's closest to the suction manifold drains the remaining water left inside the pump. The plug that's closest to the gearbox drains the oil out of the crankcase. Next, we'll remove the oil sight glass with the 5mm Allen. And next, we'll remove each of the heads with the 6mm Allen to access the diaphragms. And then remove the other 2 heads the same way. Now that we've removed the heads, we have access to the diaphragms, and from here you can check and see if there are any cracks or splits in the diaphragm. We're actually going to remove them to get a better look at them. And note the orientation of this washer, that the sharp edge is facing away from the diaphragm. We use a 13mm socket to remove the diaphragm retaining bolt. You may need to use your screwdriver to gently pry the diaphragm out. Notice that there's lettering on the one side and the other side is smooth. During reassembly, that'll be important. From here, you can bend the diaphragm and look for any cracking or splits or excessive wear. Here's an example of a worn out diaphragm that is split. You may also notice a wear pattern like that, or if chemical has been left in the pump for an extended period of time, it may break apart in small chunks like this. And there again, do the same for all 3. Diaphragm kit number 9910-Kit 2423 has these 3 decimal pan diaphragms in it. And if your oil is not contaminated, then at this point you could reinstall the new diaphragm kit. If your oil is contaminated, we'll need to take these sleeves out and wash out the inside of the pump to get that contaminated oil out. To remove the sleeves, you can rotate the pump shaft until one of them becomes loose enough to be able to get a screwdriver behind it. Or if you have a lot of corrosion in here, or if they just aren't coming loose, then you can take that small screwdriver and stick it in between the piston and the sleeve, and then get a screwdriver behind it. You can gently pry this out and repeat the same steps for the other 2 cylinders. And then from there, we can bring it into the parts washer and clean out any of that contaminated oil. You can bring the pump into a solvent tank to wash out any of that contaminated oil that may have been in there from a ruptured diaphragm. We want to clean out all of that contaminated oil and then blow out any solvent that may be left in the crankcase. Now we're ready to remove the crankshaft and piston assemblies. You'll need to take off the suction manifold by removing the 3 5mm bolts on top. And underneath here, there's a seal that you'll need to remove. A couple of ways you can take this out of here. If you tap it on the side with a screwdriver, you can knock it sideways and pull it out. Otherwise, if the plug was buried all the way down into this bore, then you'd have to punch a hole through the center of it and then pry it out with a screwdriver. From here, we'll remove the snap ring that holds in the crankshaft. And then the crankshaft itself should come right out. If you have trouble getting it out, you could take a punch or a screwdriver and give it a tap and drop it out. And here now also we can remove our piston assemblies. Piston rings will come out with them, and this plastic spacer as well. Now, if you need to change out a piston, you'll need to tear the pump down this far, and you'll need to disassemble this piston assembly by removing the retaining ring that's in here, and then tapping out this pin from the other side. There you go. Repeat this process for the other 2 pistons if necessary. I'll show you how to remove the lip seal that separates the crankcase oil from the gearbox oil. You'll need to use your large snap ring pliers and remove the snap ring that holds in that seal. And then to remove the seal itself, take a flat blade screwdriver, place the screwdriver behind the back of the seal, and in a twisting motion, gradually work it off, being careful not to damage the inside of the housing. This will only need to be replaced if it's worn, if you're starting to get the crankcase oil back into the gearbox oil. You'll notice that if the gearbox oil is overflowing and the crankcase oil is going down. Now that the pump is completely disassembled, another thing that we can look at is the valves, which we actually removed when we took off the heads earlier. And what you're looking for is either a broken spring or any wear that may be on the valve seat or the poppet, or any pitting that you might find in there. You can actually pop the valve assembly apart to get a better look and see if there's any pitting or wear in this area, and replace if necessary. 3 of the valves are facing the other way inside of the crankcase of the pump. When it was assembled, one valve is facing this way under each head, the other valve is facing this way. To get these out, you'll want to use a reverse pliers. You can pull that straight out and also examine those valves for any any wear or obstructions or broken springs. If you have noticed a decrease in pressure, it may be that you've got a worn set of valves and they should be replaced. So the first thing we'll want to do for reassembly is to put this plastic spacer in, and you want to have it so this beveled side faces down towards that ball bearing, and then put in one of your connecting rod rings facing this way, and then it's helpful to thread these diaphragm bolts into the pistons before trying to reassemble it. This will give you something to hang on to. One thing that can be helpful when putting the pistons back in is if you've got a paper towel nearby, you can fold it up and actually put it underneath the piston, between the piston and the crankcase, and this will help hold it straight in there while you put the other ones in. You'll want to lock in the step that's on this connecting rod into the connecting rod ring. And then take the other connecting rod ring, and you can put this in through the bearing side and hook it onto the connecting rods. And then it helps to pull straight out on the connecting rods just a little bit. And then put some oil on this area of your crankshaft and drop that straight in. You want to be careful not to force this shaft in. You won't have to pound it in with a hammer or anything. Basically, you want to pull out on the pistons, pull straight out to help line them up straight with the crankshaft so it'll drop straight in. You can feel it drop into the bearing down below. Good idea to turn it as you go and make sure that each of these pistons are moving freely and that you can turn the crankshaft. If you force the shaft in while you're trying to get this together, you'll damage the inside of the connecting rods. So now you can flip it over and put our retaining ring back in. Make sure that the retaining ring is snapped into the groove that's on the crankshaft. Okay. And then we can reinstall the sleeves. And to do that, you'll want to put some oil on the inside surface. Turn the stroke of the piston to its furthest point out, and it helps to put a little mark on the piston because we're going to have to make sure that this is sitting in there exactly right. If it's twisted a little bit, then the pump will lock up and you can cause internal damage. So we'll want to make sure that the rounded side of this matches the roundness of the shaft. So to put this in, it'll help to line up the split on the piston ring with one of these sides here. We'll need to compress that piston ring. You may need to take a rubber hammer and lightly tap it in. If you hit it too hard and it's not lined up right, you can break that piston ring. If you mark it in the center of this, then you want to match that up with this bolt hole. Push that straight down, make sure that it didn't turn on you. And then we can install the new diaphragm. Now the easiest way to do this is to put this through the washer first. Push this into the diaphragm instead of putting the diaphragm on and trying to put the bolt in it. And also make sure that this washer is facing out this way. Thread that in. It's an aluminum piston and a steel bolt, so you want to make sure not to strip this out. And we'll torque it to 87.5 inch-pounds. Okay, and then you'll want to turn the stroke of the piston down to seat the diaphragm into the housing. Push it in all the way around. And then, before you put the head on, you want to make sure that you have the right O-rings. The O-rings for this bottom side are very similar size to the O-rings on the top side. The larger of the two O-rings goes underneath the head, and the slightly smaller one will go on top of the head underneath the valve cap. And it helps to have some grease nearby to put into these O-ring grooves. That'll help keep it in there so you don't have a chance of it slipping out and getting pinched when you tighten the head down. Okay. So now we can just put the head on. Notice that the bolt that goes through the valve cap is a little bit longer than the rest of them. Make sure that you put these shorter ones around the head and then this longer one through the valve cap. Next we can reinstall the valves. One of them on this side had already been still in the pump. They'll face opposite directions, so you want this one to be in this way and this one to be in that way. They will only fit one way. Now you'll want to put the valve O-ring down in there first. You want to wait to do this until now. You want to wait until after you tighten these down to put that O-ring in, so you don't have a chance of pinching it when you tighten the head down. So drop that in like that. And then you'll need the O-ring for this side. Push that down in there all the way. And then there are two O-rings under this valve cap. You want to make sure that they're the correct ones. These are the smaller of the two that are this similar size. And it helps to put a little grease on the O-ring groove to help keep it in there. You want to push these in first before tightening the valve cap down. You want to meet this up so this side meets up with this valve and this longer side meets up with the one that's facing down into the crankcase. Careful not to move that O-ring so you don't pinch it. Take this longer bolt, tighten that down. Torque the head bolts to 175 inch-pounds in a crisscross pattern to run the head down evenly. As you're putting it together, it's a good idea to turn the pump a few times to make sure that you don't have one of these sleeves crooked. If one of them is turned a little bit, then you'll feel the pump lock up. You'll have to take the head off and reposition that sleeve. You'll also want to make sure to put these bases back on in the correct orientation. Now that we've installed our new diaphragms and put the heads and valves back in, the next thing to put on is this seal. You want to put a little oil around it. You don't want to reuse the old seal even if it looks okay, because it's not going to fit in there as tight as a new one. Remember that this is one of the things keeping water out of your oil. Just press that straight in by hand. That in flush, and then we'll reinstall the suction manifold. You'll want to make sure that this O-ring is in place. You can put a dab of grease on there to help hold it in. If you do have a pinched O-ring on this suction manifold or on the valve caps or on the heads, then it'll draw in air and give you some performance trouble or something. And here again, be careful not to strip these bolts out. The last thing is to reinstall the oil sight glass. and fill the pump with 30 weight non-detergent oil. Now, as you fill this, you'll notice that it'll bubble through the sight glass. You want to fill it, let it bubble out, fill it again, let it bubble, fill it again. Basically what you want to do is get oil behind the diaphragm. So if you take a couple of metric bolts, you can screw those into the crankshaft so you have something to hang on to. Then just turn the pump both ways repeatedly until you don't see any more bubbles in the sight glass. It also helps to tip it to the side a little bit. That sound is the valves working. Now that we've gotten all the air bubbles out of the crankcase, put the oil cap back on. And ready to bolt it back up and start spraying. This concludes our training for the 9910-D403. Feel free to give us a call at 1-800-468-3428 on our service line, or visit our website at hypropumps.com.